The Aztec blood doctors' healers cut their own flesh to draw out a patient's sickness. Their blood mixed with the sick, life for life, and they weren't the only ones who did this. This and more coming up. Hey there, welcome to my channel. Let's take a journey back in time and learn about the creepy medical practices that were normal before modern medicine. So grab a stool and sit back while I regale you with tales of pain, suffering, and questionable choices our ancestors made in the name of healing. Trepanation was a common practice among many ancient cultures, including the Aztecs. Now, trepanation is fancy doctor talk for drilling a hole into the skull. The Aztecs practiced a form of trepanation called trephining. They believed that the process could cure a variety of ailments, including headaches, epilepsy, and even mental illness. It was also used as a treatment for injuries sustained during battles or in everyday life, such as those caused by falls or animal attacks. But wait a second, hasn't science long since discarded this method? Nope. Trephining was still being performed into the 20th century. As late as the 1940s, doctors at Bellevue Hospital in New York performed trepanations on patients suffering from severe mental illness. In fact, some argue that removing a part of the skull can help alleviate pressure on the brain and reduce symptoms associated with mental health conditions like schizophrenia. Could it be that the ancient Aztecs were onto something here? Maybe. While trepanation might seem like an extreme measure to treat headaches or other minor illnesses, it was seen as a necessary evil by many cultures, including the Aztecs. They believed that by opening up the head, they could allow evil spirits or bad air to escape and be replaced with good air or positive energy. However, what made Aztec trephining unique was the way it was carried out. Instead of using a sharp instrument to drill a hole in the skull, the Aztecs preferred to use a special tool called a trephine. The trephine was a circular piece of wood or stone that had teeth around its edge, kind of like a giant pizza cutter. To perform the operation, the Aztec priest would first make an incision in the scalp, then place the trephine against the skull and rotate it to cut a circle through the bone. Once the hole was made, the priest would remove the trephine and scrape away the bone fragments. Finally, they would close up the wound and wait for the patient to recover. While this may sound horrifying to us now, trepanation was considered a relatively quick and easy procedure for the Aztecs. They believed that by opening up the head, they could allow the body to heal itself and expel any harmful substances that might be causing illness or injury. But it wasn't just the physical pain that was endured during these procedures. Aztec trephining was also a deeply spiritual experience. The Aztecs believed that the human body was composed of both a physical and spiritual essence, and that these two aspects were interconnected. When someone became ill or injured, it was believed that their spiritual essence had become imbalanced or disconnected from their physical body. The goal of trephining was to restore balance and connection between these two parts of the self. While trephining was effective at treating some ailments, it was not without its risks. Infections and other complications could arise from the procedure, sometimes leading to death. Despite this, the practice continued for centuries, and it wasn't until the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire that trephining was finally put to an end. Let me ask you a question. What do you think about when you hear the word sacrifice? For me, it's images of ancient rituals, maybe even a bit of blood and guts. But what if I told you that sacrifice wasn't just a part of history, but a staple of everyday life in ancient Mexico? Yeah, I'm not kidding. In the old days, people were so into sacrifice that it was considered a regular practice in their daily lives. They sacrificed all sorts of things, including food, flowers, and even their own bodies. They believed that these sacrifices would help keep the world in balance and show their gods how much they appreciated them. Crazy, right? Well, it's true. And it was especially common among the Mesoamerican cultures like the Aztecs and Mayans. These cultures believed that their gods needed constant attention, and the best way to get their attention was through sacrifice. They believed that by giving up something precious, like their own blood, they could stay on the good side of the gods and ensure that they wouldn't be punished with natural disasters, disease, or war. Blood was considered the essence of life, and by sacrificing their blood, humans were essentially giving the gods a piece of their soul. Now, you might be thinking this sounds kind of extreme, and you're not wrong. But to these ancient cultures, it was just another Tuesday. It was common for people to sacrifice themselves by getting their blood sucked out, or by cutting open their chests and taking out their hearts. Talk about a gruesome way to go. But hey, they believed it was worth it to keep the gods happy and ensure a better life for everyone. So, next time you think you're having a bad day, just remember it could be a whole lot worse. You could be living in ancient Mexico and about to have your heart ripped out. The Mayans had their own unique approach to bloodletting, which involved making small cuts on the genitals, face and ears to let a few drops of blood trickle down the body. They believed that letting blood run over specific parts of the body could cure various illnesses and even help prevent future ones. Some of the illnesses they claimed their bloodletting could cure included stomach aches, skin problems, and fever. Now, we don't know exactly how well this method worked, but it sure was a bold and creative approach to medicine. After all, it's not every day you hear of someone treating their fever by cutting themselves on the privates, and it wasn't just the Mayans who were into this sort of thing either. Other Mesoamerican cultures like the Aztecs and the Zapotec also practiced bloodletting. They believed that by releasing blood, they were helping to purify the body and get rid of impurities that could lead to illness or injury. The Aztecs in particular had a whole system of bloodletting based on the balance of hot and cold in the body. They believed that if someone was too hot, they needed to release hot blood, while someone who was too cold needed to release cold blood. Talk about a unique theory. Overall, the Mayans and other Mesoamerican cultures had some pretty interesting ideas about medicine and the human body. While their methods may seem strange to us today, they were part of a larger cultural belief system that viewed illness and injury as a disruption of the body as balance. By restoring balance through practices like bloodletting, they believed they could heal the body and prevent future ailments. In ancient Mesoamerica, blood was considered the essence of life, and it was believed that by sacrificing or releasing one's blood, they could gain control over their fate. From the Aztecs to the Mayans, cultures across the region had their own unique beliefs and practices surrounding blood sacrifice and bloodletting. One of the most common methods of blood sacrifice was the use of thorns. Thorns were typically made from sharp stones or bone, and were inserted into the skin to collect blood as it oozed out. This practice was seen as a form of showing devotion to the gods and was often done during religious ceremonies or rituals. In some cases, the blood was collected in a bowl or vessel and used in other rituals or offerings. Bloodletting, on the other hand, was a broader term that encompassed various practices to draw blood from the body. This could include making incisions in the skin or using instruments like lancets or leeches. Bloodletting was often used as a form of medicine and was believed to help cure various ailments or prevent future ones. Regardless of the method used, blood sacrifice and bloodletting were an integral part of life in ancient Mesoamerica. These practices were not only a way to appease the gods, but also a means of understanding and controlling one's place in the universe. But it wasn't just blood that was important. The Nahuatl people of central Mexico had a fascinating belief system that extended beyond the concept of blood. They believed that everything in the universe was composed of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. These elements were represented by different colors, with blue representing water, yellow representing earth, red representing fire, and white representing air. The Nahuatl people believed that illness resulted from an imbalance in these elements within the body. For example, an imbalance of blue and yellow could cause sadness, while an imbalance of red and white could result in fever. To diagnose a patient, healers would examine their urine, which they believed could reveal the color imbalances present in their bodies. Once the imbalance was identified, the healers would perform a ritual to restore balance by manipulating the elements. This could involve drinking a concoction of herbs or undergoing a purification ceremony. The Nahuatl people's belief system was a holistic approach to medicine that took into account the spiritual, physical, and emotional aspects of a person's being. So, what do you think? Did you find these historical medical practices fascinating, or maybe a little bit horrifying? Well, fear not, because I have plenty more videos where I explore the weird and wacky ways that people have tried to heal themselves throughout history. So stay tuned and let me know in the comments below what you want to see next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Masks have always been an integral part of human culture. They've been used for religious ceremonies, festivals, ballets, theater performances, political protests, and even medical treatments. Throughout history, people have worn masks made from a variety of materials, including leather, wood, wax, metal, and, of course, fabric. But one particular type of mask has managed to capture the public's imagination like no other: the plague mask. These bizarre-looking contraptions, typically made from leather or cloth and usually featuring a long beak or nose-like appendage, are instantly recognizable and undeniably creepy. And when you consider the fact that they were allegedly used by doctors to treat victims of the bubonic plague, it's easy to see why they've become such enduring symbols of death and disease. Of course, while the idea of doctors wearing these grotesque masks may seem completely absurd to us today, they were once cutting-edge medical technology. At least that's what the doctors who wore them believed. But how did they come up with such an unusual treatment? And what was it supposed to accomplish? To answer these questions, we need to take a brief trip back in time to the 17th century, when the bubonic plague was at the height of its power. The plague, which is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, first arrived in Europe in the mid-1300s, where it proceeded to cause massive devastation. Over the next few centuries, the disease would kill an estimated 25 million people, or about half of Europe's entire population. For most of human history, doctors had no idea what caused the plague. All they knew was that it seemed to arrive every few years, causing widespread death and misery in its wake. As a result, there were few effective treatments, and the mortality rate was nearly 100%. As we now know, the bubonic plague is spread by fleas that live on rats, and while it can be spread through the air, the most common form of transmission is through the bite of an infected flea. When a person is bitten, the bacteria enters their bloodstream and quickly begins multiplying. This causes the lymph nodes to swell, resulting in the characteristic buboes that give the illness its name. From there, the bacteria spreads throughout the body, causing fever, chills, weakness, pain, and vomiting. Within days, the victim is dead. Given the high mortality rate and lack of effective treatments, it's not surprising that people were desperate to find a cure. Unfortunately, most of the proposed remedies were not only useless but often harmful. For example, one popular treatment was to cover the buboes with toads or live fish, which were thought to suck the infection out of the skin. Another common therapy involved drinking large amounts of wine or vinegar, which was supposed to purify the blood. In reality, these treatments did nothing more than delay the inevitable. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a growing belief that the plague was caused by an imbalance of the four humors which were thought to be the essential elements of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. The idea was that in order to maintain good health, these humors needed to be kept in balance, but when they were out of whack, it could lead to illness and disease. Some doctors even went so far as to claim that the plague was a form of punishment from God for people who had committed sins. This belief led some to seek out flagellants, people who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves in order to atone for their sins and gain God's forgiveness. Of course, this didn't do much to stop the spread of the disease either. By the early 1600s, the search for a cure had turned to alchemy, the medieval precursor to chemistry. Alchemists experimented with a variety of substances, including mercury, arsenic, and sulfuric acid, all in an attempt to find a panacea for the plague. Of course, this was not particularly successful either. In fact, some of these substances actually made the disease worse. But one substance in particular stood out. In 1616, a German physician named Johann Weyer described a powder made from dried flowers and herbs that he claimed could cure the plague. While the recipe for the powder varied depending on the source, it typically included ingredients like lavender, camphor, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, orange peel, rose petals, thyme, basil, and sage. The theory was that these ingredients would release a pleasant-smelling vapor when heated, which would then purify the air and kill the disease-causing vapors. Now, while this sounds completely insane, the alchemists were actually onto something here. The problem with treating airborne diseases is that the pathogens are invisible to the naked eye, so it's difficult to know if the air is really contaminated. If you could somehow purify the air without knowing whether or not it was contaminated in the first place, how would you know if your treatment was working? In order to get around this problem, they came up with a way to visualize the air itself, and they did this by introducing a non-toxic chemical called sulfur dioxide into the air. When the gas was released, it reacted with the water in the air to form tiny droplets that could be seen floating around. These droplets represented the invisible disease-causing vapors, and they were known as miasma. Now that they had a way to visualize the air, doctors began experimenting with different methods of purifying it. One of the most popular techniques involved burning incense made from the aforementioned plague powder. Doctors would enter a patient's room wearing special masks that covered their entire face. These masks were typically made from leather and had long beaks attached to them. The beaks were designed to collect the fragrant fumes and vapors coming from the incense, which were then released through holes in the mask. The idea was that by wearing this mask, the doctor was protecting themselves from inhaling the disease-causing miasma. But some doctors took this a step further and claimed that the masks could actually heal the sick. This was because they incorporated another piece of technology, a tube-like device that could be inserted into a patient's mouth. This allowed the doctor to suck the miasma-filled air directly out of the patient's lungs. Now, while this all sounds completely ridiculous, there's a reason why doctors believed this would work. You see, the concept of germs wasn't developed until the late 1800s. Before that, the idea of contagion was relatively unknown. Instead, doctors believed that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of the humors, bad air, or a failure of the body's natural defenses. This is why they spent so much time trying to balance the humors or purify the air. They genuinely believed that these things were causing the illness. Unfortunately, this meant that most treatments were ineffective or even harmful, like the bloodletting therapy, which weakened patients by removing blood. But there were also some rare cases where patients did recover from the plague, and doctors attributed this to their own treatments. This gave them the false impression that they were making a difference. And so the plague doctors continued to don their strange masks and try to suck the plague out of their patients. Of course, this didn't actually work. In most cases, it probably made things worse by weakening the patient and exposing them to more disease. But there were also likely some instances where the miasma theory happened to be correct. That is, the smoky, incense-filled rooms might have actually killed off some of the disease-causing pathogens in the air. This is purely speculation, however, since there is no way to prove it. It should also be noted that some historians have argued that the masks were not really meant to heal anyone. Instead, they were simply a way for doctors to protect themselves from getting sick. This might have been true in some cases, but it doesn't explain why doctors would claim that the masks could cure the disease. It's possible that they genuinely believed this, or it could have been a way to make money by giving people false hope. After all, the plague was incredibly deadly, and there was very little that doctors could do to help. If they had a treatment that didn't do any harm, it might have been worth a try. In the end, the plague doctors' bizarre rituals were a product of their time. They were well-meaning individuals who were trying to help people, but they were hampered by the lack of scientific knowledge. Fortunately, we've come a long way since then, and we now know how to prevent and treat diseases like the plague. But that doesn't mean that we should forget about the lessons of the past. The next time you see a plague doctor's mask, take a moment to remember the brave doctors who wore them and the patients who suffered at their hands. What is the most painful thing that you have ever experienced? A paper cut, stubbed toe, or getting kicked in the balls? How about having your arm torn off by a chariot wheel or being stabbed through the throat with a spear? Well, if you were unfortunate enough to be injured in battle in the Roman Empire, these would not be the most painful things that you could experience because those were just everyday occurrences for the surgeons of Rome. These surgeons were some of the most sadistic people of their time because they performed surgery without anesthesia, and they also did it in front of an audience. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to look at what life was like for the Roman surgeons. The surgeons would perform operations on soldiers in the field, usually in a tent. So the first thing you would see when you entered the tent was blood everywhere. There would be blood covering the walls, the floor, the ceiling, even the clothes of the surgeon himself. This would be quite off-putting, but unfortunately you would have no other choice than to lie down on the blood-soaked mattress and wait for your turn, because there would usually be many soldiers waiting to be operated on. This would take hours, so you would sit there watching the surgeons operate on the men before you, and this would be excruciatingly painful to watch because the surgeries that they performed were extremely violent, and they were done so without any painkillers. The Roman surgeons would not even use herbal remedies that the Greeks used, such as opium. They didn't believe that these kinds of drugs should be used for surgery. Imagine sitting there watching your fellow soldiers get operated on, and you hear them scream in pain. Then suddenly one of the surgeons looks up at you and asks, "What is your injury?" You tell him and he says, "Ah, I know just how to fix that." He then takes his scalpel and plunges it into your abdomen. That is exactly what happened in the operating tents of Rome. It was like a horror show. The Romans had a saying, "In vino veritas," which meant that in wine there is truth. But really, what they meant by this was that in wine there is courage. It was said that before the surgeries took place, the soldiers would drink large amounts of wine to give themselves courage. Sometimes the patients would actually die from the amount of alcohol that they consumed before surgery. One Roman writer described how the scene of the surgeon's tent reminds him of a slaughterhouse. The next part of the experience would be the actual surgery. Some sources say that the doctors would make incisions in the patient's body with their bare hands, while others say that they would do it with a knife. But either way, this would be extremely painful. If you got your arm torn off by a chariot wheel, then your bone would be exposed and the surgeon would need to clean the wound. This would mean that they would dig their fingers or instruments deep inside your body. When they did this, they would not wash their hands beforehand. These surgeons were the lowest on the social rungs. They were looked down upon by everybody, including the patients that they operated on. Most of the surgeons were slaves or freedmen who had been taught the art of surgery by other, usually Greek, surgeons. The pay was not good for these surgeons, so most of them had to rely on bribes from the patient's relatives to make extra money. So now imagine you are lying on that bloody mattress and the surgeon digs his unwashed fingers into your open wound and pulls out the bone fragments. After this, he would take a burning iron and cauterize the wound. That is, he would burn the wound shut. This was extremely painful, but it was nothing new to the surgeons. They had done this hundreds of times before. The reason why they used burning irons was because they believed that it helped the healing process. This has actually been proven by modern science. Burning a wound does help it heal faster, but it's only effective if the burn is superficial. However, the Roman surgeons would go deeper than they should, causing more pain to their patients. They would burn the flesh around the wound, causing third-degree burns. This caused blisters to form, which would then burst and cause even more pain. One surgeon named Galen described a new method of stitching wounds. This method was less painful than using burning irons because stitching would close the wound quicker and it left smaller scars. However, this meant that the surgeon had to touch the patient's wound with his hands. This made the surgeons very reluctant to try this new method because they despised touching wounds. So the burning iron remained the preferred method of closing wounds. Some of the tools that they used were horribly designed. For example, one of the forceps that they used looked like a pair of pliers, but it was much larger. The surgeon would hold both ends of the forceps in his hands and squeeze them together. This would crush the bones instead of gripping them. The same tool would then be used to pull out the crushed bone. You can probably guess the pain that this would cause. But if you were really unlucky, then the surgeon would put a tube into your body. This would be to suck out the pus from the wound. They would then take the tube and plunge it into another wound and repeat the process. Can you imagine the kind of bacteria that this would introduce into the patient's body? This would often lead to the patient dying from infection. If you were very unlucky, then you might end up on the operating table again. This time, the surgeon would pull out the infected flesh from your wound. They would do this with a sharp tool. Every time the tool touched your body, it would feel like knives piercing your skin. After this, the surgeon would again use the burning iron to close the wound. You would think that after all this torture the patient would die, but many of them actually survived. However, it was unlikely that they would survive for long, because the next step would be the recovery process. This was by far the worst part of the treatment. The surgeon would give the patient some food, but it would be stale and rancid. This was to keep the cost down. The patient would then return home, where he would continue to recover. Unfortunately, there was no rest for the wounded soldier. He would be expected to rejoin his unit as soon as possible. If he wasn't fit to fight, then his commanding officer would request that the surgeon come to his camp and operate on the unfit soldier. The surgeon would then arrive with his slave-turned-assistant, and the operation would begin again. But there was a rumor that the surgeons spread about their work that made the soldiers almost enjoy the surgery. The soldiers said that when the smoke rose from the burning irons, it carried with it the whispers of the dead. They said that the dead loved to tell jokes and make comments about the living. This would entertain the soldiers while they waited their turn to be operated on. How true this is, we will never know. Maybe the dead really did talk to each other. After all, the greatest special effects are created by the human mind. And what could be more effective than the idea that the dead are communicating through the smoke? Perhaps the surgeons did this on purpose to distract the soldiers from the pain. As we have said, most of the Roman surgeons were freed slaves. Slaves were not allowed to perform surgery on free men. So if a free man needed an operation, then he would have to go to Greece. The Greeks were known for their advanced medical knowledge. They had universities dedicated to the study of medicine. The Romans despised this because they thought that medicine was beneath them. So they came up with their own system of treating illnesses and injuries. Unfortunately, this led to the sadistic practices that we have told you about today. So it was actually better to be a slave in Rome because if you were injured, you wouldn't have to go through the horrible experience that we have described. So what is the most painful thing that you have ever experienced? Let us know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching. Have you ever wondered if there was an ancient cure for all ailments? If you've been suffering from a nagging cough or maybe the sniffles, you might have considered Western medicine. But maybe you'd like something a little more alternative. Well, look no further than 2,400-year-old China. There they had the perfect solution. In fact, all you needed to do was lay back and let them stick some sharp rocks in your bones. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to be talking about the creepy practice of bone setting in ancient China. First, we'll cover the procedure itself, and then later talk about some interesting legends surrounding it. So grab your leeches and let's get into it. So it's important to note that in ancient China, bone setting was practiced by doctors, not necessarily quacks or witch doctors. These were men who dedicated their lives to healing, just with a slightly different toolkit than what we're used to today. In fact, many of these doctors probably wouldn't be out of place in modern-day hospitals. They kept detailed notes on their patients and even developed diagnostic techniques similar to those we use today. For example, they would feel a patient's pulse to determine whether or not they had a fever. They also believed illnesses could be caused by things like stress and diet, both incredibly modern ideas. It's important to understand the context of medical practices during this time period. The earliest forms of Chinese medicine date back to 1600 BCE. That's hundreds of years before Hippocrates was even born. And while Hippocrates is now considered the father of modern medicine, he had a relatively limited toolkit compared to his Chinese contemporaries. For example, unlike Chinese medicine, Hippocrates did not believe in treating the whole body when sick. Instead, he focused on specific symptoms. He also relied heavily on purging and bloodletting as cures for almost every ailment. But that's a topic for another video. Back in ancient China, doctors had a plethora of techniques at their disposal to treat a wide variety of symptoms. One of the most common was acupuncture, which was used to treat over 100 different ailments. Acupuncture is still in use today, and its popularity has been growing in recent decades. It works by inserting thin needles into specific points on the body to alleviate pain or treat various conditions. Now we know this might sound scary, but the Chinese took this practice to a whole new level. You see, regular acupuncture needles are usually made of stainless steel or some other metal. But Chinese doctors preferred a different material: jade. Jade was highly prized in Chinese culture, not only because it was rare and beautiful, but because it was associated with mystical powers. It was considered to be a symbol of purity and immortality. In fact, it was so popular that entire tombs were built out of it, such as the famous one discovered in 1970 containing the first emperor of China. But why would they choose such a precious material to stick in people's bodies? Well, according to legend, jade has the ability to absorb impurities and evil spirits. This was especially useful when treating certain types of illnesses. You see, ancient Chinese doctors believed that sickness was caused by an imbalance of either cold or heat in the body. This is similar to the traditional Chinese view that the human body functions like the seasons. When a person is healthy, they have a balance of hot and cold, just like summer and winter. But when they become sick, the balance is broken. Heat is everywhere. During summer, it's easy to get too much of it and become ill. Just think about how many colds you catch after being cooped up inside during the winter. Now, back in ancient China, they didn't have air conditioning. So when summer rolled around, everyone would spend more time outdoors. This meant that people were constantly bombarded with heat, leading to all sorts of illnesses. The Chinese believed that these summer illnesses were caused by an influx of hot and evil spirits entering the body through the skin. And the best way to combat this was with cold, pure jade. This is where the bone setters came in. You see, they believed that inserting cold jade needles into a patient's bones could help realign the flow of energy and drive out those pesky spirits. Sounds crazy, right? Well, let's take a closer look. The process began with the patient laying down on a table, usually naked. Then the doctor would examine them by feeling their pulse, looking at their tongue, and asking about their symptoms. After making a diagnosis, the doctor would prepare the patient for treatment. This involved scraping the area where the needles would be inserted to remove any dirt or dead skin. The doctor would then disinfect their hands and wrap the jade needles in cloth. Finally, they would insert the needles and begin the extraction process. These needles were no bigger than normal acupuncture ones, ranging from 0.2 to 0.4 inches long. They were also extremely sharp to minimize damage to the flesh. The doctor would insert the needle in a quick motion, then slowly twist it back and forth. This was done to break up any blockages in the flow of energy and allow it to move freely once again. To reduce pain, the doctor would sometimes apply a special paste made of herbs and animal fat. They would also burn dried herbs near the patient to produce a pleasant smell and soothe the body. After the procedure, the patient would need to rest for several hours before getting up. It was also important for them to wear loose clothing so that their body could continue to expel the extracted substances. Overall, the process was quite painful, but it was worth it for the relief that followed. However, the Chinese didn't stop at just inserting needles. They developed an array of techniques to extract whatever was bothering the patient. One method involved rotating the bones to help realign them. Another technique was to pull out a person's hair to remove lice and dirt. Sometimes doctors would even apply leeches to suck out the bad stuff. Bloodletting was another popular practice, often done by scratching the skin with a sharp tool. Doctors believed this could help remove impurities from the blood and prevent diseases from spreading throughout the body. They also had a unique approach to setting broken bones. Instead of just putting them back in place, the Chinese doctors believed that the bones could be reset in a better position. This was done by manipulating the broken pieces until they were aligned correctly. The bones were then held in place with splints made of wood or bamboo. This method was not only effective, but it also allowed for quicker healing times. Now let's talk about some of the crazier legends surrounding the bone setters. One story tells of a doctor who was able to save a man's life by sucking the poison from his finger. Another legend has it that one doctor was able to remove a bullet from someone's body using only his mouth. These stories may be exaggerated, but they show just how revered these bone setters were in ancient China. Even though many of these practices might seem strange to us today, it's important to remember that they were once considered cutting-edge medicine. The bone setters of China were not only skilled practitioners, but they were also brave enough to try anything to help their patients. While these stories are fascinating, there's another aspect of them that's equally intriguing. It's the fact that they were passed down through word of mouth. Back in ancient times, there were no medical journals or textbooks. Knowledge was shared through stories and legends. This meant that the most skilled doctors became folk heroes, their names and deeds becoming part of local folklore. Unfortunately, many of these tales have been lost to time. Those that remain are often filled with dramatic flair to make them more memorable. But they still offer us a glimpse into the world of ancient Chinese medicine and the amazing feats that doctors were capable of. As we continue to learn more about traditional Chinese medicine, we can appreciate the ingenuity of the bone setters even more. Their willingness to experiment and push the boundaries of what was possible led to the development of some truly unique and effective treatments. Who knows? Maybe someday we'll rediscover a lost art that can help us heal in ways we never thought possible. And speaking of lost arts, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button. With your support, we can continue to explore the fascinating history of medicine and uncover the secrets of ancient healing practices. Thanks for watching. If a priest cut open your veins under the light of a full moon, would you consider that an act of healing or sacrifice? Would you think of it as a treatment to cure a disease or a ritual to appease the gods? This question may sound absurd, but for some people, especially those living in ancient Egypt, it was commonplace. During the era of the pharaohs, priests were trained not only to perform surgeries and treat illnesses, but also to practice bloodletting, the draining of blood from the human body. But what's the connection between bloodletting and the moon? And what role did the priests play in these strange practices? To understand why Egyptian priests performed bloodletting rituals under the moonlight, we have to first look at the practice itself and how it was viewed by ancient civilizations. The process of removing blood from the body dates back to at least 2500 BC. Some of the earliest recorded instances come from the Sumerians, who believed that illness could be cured by removing the offending part of the body where the disease had entered. They might remove an infected finger or even an eye, and the next step, if necessary, was to drain the patient's blood. So the removal of blood wasn't seen as a standalone procedure, but as the final step in other treatments. But why would they drain the blood? It all comes down to the four humors. This theory proposed that all humans are made up of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These corresponded to four properties or humors in the body, which were phlegm, yellow and black bile, and blood. Each of these had to be in balance to keep us healthy. Too much or too little of any one humor could cause illness. Removing blood, therefore, became a way to rebalance the body. It was like turning down the volume on a particularly loud instrument in an orchestra so that it blends better with the others. This theory came to prominence around the time of the Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived from 400 BC until 350 BC. His teachings formed the foundation of Western medicine for more than 1,500 years. His ideas about the four humors, along with astrology and other beliefs, provided a framework for understanding diseases and their cures. This meant bloodletting was widely practiced for centuries throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East, including in Egypt. Egyptians were among the first to use metal razors to cut open veins. In earlier times, they used sharp pieces of pottery, but these were unreliable since the pottery would dull after a few uses. Making incisions with bronze knives allowed them to collect more blood without harming the patient. The Egyptians kept detailed records of these procedures, and they left behind examples of the tools used for the job. Doctors who studied the practice were able to learn a great deal from the Egyptians about bloodletting. However, there was still a problem. For every theory about how to cure illness, there is a counter-theory explaining why everything is the god's fault. Ancient Egyptians were polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods. Some of these deities demanded sacrifices. So when someone was ill, they might have asked themselves, what has the patient done to incur the wrath of the gods? To appease these angry deities, they would perform bloodletting rituals. During these ceremonies, they would offer the patient's blood as a gift to the gods, hoping that this would restore their health. So why did they choose the night of the full moon? It probably had something to do with the shape of the moon itself. If you sliced it in half, you'd end up with two semicircular halves. This shape was sacred to the Egyptians because it resembled the crescent moon and represented fertility and rebirth. One god in particular associated with the moon was Thoth. He was the deity of wisdom and magic, and he was usually depicted with an ibis or baboon head. The ancient Egyptians believed that every full moon cycle, Thoth would weigh people's hearts against the feather of justice to determine whether they had lived good lives. If the heart was heavier than the feather, then the person would be sent to the underworld to face judgment. But if they passed this test, they were rewarded with a place in the afterlife. This created an urgent need to be on your best behavior. Under such strict divine scrutiny, the Egyptians wanted to make sure that they didn't offend any gods during the month leading up to the full moon. That's why many bloodletting rituals were scheduled for nights with a full moon. The hope was that by giving an offering of blood, they would be able to stave off any potential disease or disaster that might befall them during the next lunar cycle. The ancient Egyptians weren't the only ones to do this either. The Chinese also believed that the full moon phase was the ideal time to perform bloodletting. For them, it was all about balancing the yin and yang. Yin is often described as feminine, dark, cold, soft, and passive. Yang, on the other hand, is masculine, light, hot, hard, and active. These forces must be in balance to keep the body healthy, but during the full moon, yang energy is at its strongest. So bloodletting was used to bring the body back into balance. The Aztecs had similar beliefs. They too thought that the full moon phase was best for bloodletting. They even had a word for it, quosotl, which means flow of life water. The Maya practiced bloodletting as well. They believed that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of hot and cold factors within the body. Bloodletting was used to restore the balance, but they also offered the blood to the gods as a sacrifice. The reason for the latter can be seen in the work of archaeologists who discovered sites with bloodletting instruments alongside sacrificial remains. However, it's important to remember that the ancient world wasn't a monolithic entity. Not everyone did things the same way. While bloodletting was common in Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica, the Jews rejected the practice. Exodus 20:25 clearly states, "You shall not cut your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord." In this passage, God tells Moses that bloodletting and tattoos are forbidden. He considers them polluting, as they both involve the shedding of blood and altering the body. In general, the practice of bloodletting fell out of favor around the late 19th century. People started to realize that drawing blood didn't really fix the underlying causes of most illnesses, and it could even be harmful. Today, it's still sometimes used to treat conditions like malaria, where the blood is replaced with donated blood from a healthy person. But overall, bloodletting is no longer a common medical practice. As for the Egyptian priests who practiced bloodletting, historians believe that many of them were trained in mathematics and astronomy. They needed to know the timing of the lunar cycle precisely, so they could perform their rituals at the right time. But they also needed to know geometry to calculate the correct angles for the incision, and they needed to know arithmetic to figure out how much blood needed to be drawn. Some scholars even think that the priests' knowledge of the stars helped them develop the first rudimentary forms of insurance. Imagine you go to the priest and ask him to perform bloodletting on the night of the full moon. You tell him that you've been having headaches lately, and you hope that the procedure will help. After making his calculations, he tells you that the next full moon is just not quite right. The procedure won't work unless the moon is exactly full. If you want to try again next month, you'll have to pay him another fee. At the time, the concept of paying for a service in advance might have seemed radical, but that's exactly what the priests were doing. They were taking bets on whether or not someone would get sick before the next full moon. If nobody got sick, then the priest pocketed the money. If someone did get sick, then they received payment for treating the person. In a sense, this was a very primitive form of actuarial science, the kind of math used by insurance companies today. There's no denying that the Egyptian priests were highly intelligent and well-educated individuals. But the next time you see a picture of a pharaoh being bled under the light of the full moon, ask yourself, was it a medical treatment or a sacrifice? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. What would you do if you were sentenced to death? Would you prefer a quick death or an agonizing, slow death? Well, during the Middle Ages, there was no choice. You got whatever death you were given, and sometimes that meant being locked up in a stone house while you slowly died from one of history's most horrible diseases. These plague houses are a dark part of history that most people aren't aware of. So today we'll be talking about them. So grab some medieval honey, because this is going to be a sweet ride. All right, let's dive into it. Welcome to my channel. Today, we will look at the creepy plague keepers that medieval doctors used to lock plague victims inside stone houses. If you like stories like these, make sure to stay tuned because there are plenty more where this came from. During the Middle Ages, it was common practice for doctors to treat patients with a variety of strange and sometimes painful methods. During this time period, there were not really any antibiotics or other modern medical treatments available. So many illnesses and injuries could be fatal. Plague was one of the most feared diseases of all time, and it killed millions of people in Europe alone. The symptoms of the disease were terrible and included high fever, weakness, black spots on the skin, bleeding from the nose and mouth, delirium, and convulsions. As you can imagine, the mortality rate was very high and there was no cure. There were many theories as to how the plague was spread and how to treat it. But one of the most popular beliefs among medieval doctors was that the best way to get rid of the plague was to sweat it out. They believed that by inducing sweating, they could help the body get rid of the disease. There were also some physicians who believed that the plague was caused by an imbalance of the four humors, and so they treated their patients accordingly. However, none of these methods were very effective, and the plague continued to ravage Europe for centuries. One of the most extreme methods that doctors used to try and cure the plague was by locking their patients inside stone houses. This may sound crazy, but it was actually done quite often. The idea was that by sealing the patient inside a house made of stone, they would be able to sweat out the disease. In some cases, the patients were left to die. In others, they were visited regularly by doctors and nurses to monitor their condition. The problem with this method of treatment was that it didn't work. Not only that, but it also meant that the patient had to endure the symptoms of the plague for days or even weeks without any real hope of getting better. Can you imagine anything worse than that? So why did doctors do this? Well, as we said before, they really had no other options. They genuinely believed that it was the best course of action for their patients. What's more, they probably didn't think that it was all that bad. For the most part, the doctors of the time were well off and educated. They probably didn't have much experience with how the poor lived. So they didn't realize just how awful this kind of treatment would be. Furthermore, the doctors were probably also trying to protect the general public from the plague. By isolating patients, they hoped to stop the spread of the disease. Whether or not this actually worked is debatable. But in the minds of the doctors, it was worth a shot. Let's take a closer look at one of these plague houses. These stone houses were usually small and made of stone. They were built in the 14th and 15th centuries when the plague was at its worst. One of the most famous ones is the Pest House in London. It was built in 1348 and used to isolate patients with the plague. Another one is the Pest House in Dorchester, which was used during the outbreak of 1665. Finally, the third example we will discuss is the Red House in Reading, which was built in the 17th century and used as a quarantine house for people coming into the town from areas affected by the plague. Each of these buildings has a tragic history and played a role in the fight against the plague. Now, let's talk about what happened inside these plague houses. The patients were usually locked inside for weeks at a time. They were given food and water, but they were mostly left to their own devices. Some of the patients were able to recover, but many died. The bodies were sometimes left inside the houses for days or even weeks until they could be removed. The smell from the rotting corpses was so bad that neighbors complained. So, who were the patients like? Well, it varied. Sometimes it was whole families who were locked inside the houses. Other times it was just individual patients. The patients were usually poor and had no other place to go. Many of them were already weak and sick when they were locked inside the houses, and they died soon after arriving. So now we know what happened inside the houses, but what happened after the patients died. As we said before, the bodies were sometimes left inside the houses for days or even weeks. When they were finally removed, they were usually buried in mass graves. This was done to prevent the spread of disease. The bodies were also sometimes burned. This was seen as a way to purify the body and prevent the disease from spreading. Now, let's talk about the aftermath of the plague houses. After the plague had run its course, the houses were either abandoned or torn down. In some cases, they were used as quarantine houses for people coming into town from areas affected by the plague. In other cases, they were simply forgotten about. The sites of these plague houses are still visible today in some towns and cities. They are a reminder of the terrible disease that once ravaged Europe and the desperate measures that were taken to try and stop its spread. But now, let's talk about something else. What do you think about the plague doctors who locked their patients inside these houses? Was it a necessary evil, or were they simply misguided? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to stay tuned for more videos like this. But now it's time to wrap things up. What do you think about the plague doctors and their strange methods? Do you know anything about the plague houses in your area? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to stay tuned for more videos. Thanks for watching. Goodbye. Now let's move on to the next video. Click here to watch this video. Why did the Black Death happen? Or click here to watch this video. The bubonic plague is back. A mysterious set of skulls have been discovered that show signs of an ancient medical procedure known as trepanation. But what's really crazy is what they found inside the skulls. You won't believe this. In certain cultures around the world, there are documented cases of a surgical procedure where an opening or hole is drilled into the skull. Now, this may sound scary, and it definitely would be if someone was doing it to you. But these days we have a pretty good understanding of the human brain, and wouldn't think of doing such a thing unless it was absolutely necessary, like in the case of an extremely dangerous brain tumor. But back in the day, the human brain was a much more mysterious thing, and many cultures believed the skull could be opened up without harming the person inside. And so trepanation became a common practice among shamans and doctors. Across the globe, this process of drilling a hole into the skull has been practiced independently by several cultures and dates back thousands of years. In some cases, archaeologists found evidence of trepanation going back as far as 65 million years. Some scientists have even suggested the practice began as early as 8000 BC. These practices were not only performed by primitive tribes, but also by advanced civilizations like the Egyptians and the Inca. So why were people willing to risk death with such a procedure? What did they hope to gain from sticking a drill into their heads? Well, the answer depends on who was performing the operation. In some cases, it was a desperate attempt at saving a life. In others, it was part of a spiritual ceremony meant to bring a person closer to the divine. To understand the trepanation shamans, we need to understand what a shaman is. The term shaman comes from the Tungusic word sadan, which means one who knows the secret. Shamans were practitioners of a form of spiritual healing. They were kind of like psychiatrists and priests rolled into one. They acted as intermediaries between the physical world and the spirit world. Many cultures had their own version of the shaman, though they might have been known by a different name. In America, they were called medicine men, or curanderos. In Africa, they were called nganga, or bokor. And in Europe, they were called witch doctors, though that term now has a very negative connotation. Shamanism is one of the oldest forms of spiritual practice on Earth. It predates agriculture and settled society. Shamans don't just do rituals and cast spells. They actually go out into nature and seek inspiration from plants and animals. This is how shamans gained their knowledge and passed it down through oral tradition. When acting as healers, shamans would use whatever methods they had available to them to treat ailments. Sometimes they used herbs and other natural remedies. Other times they used techniques like hypnotism and dream analysis, and sometimes they used a little bit of everything. Shamans were also responsible for communicating with spirits on behalf of their community. They would speak to the dead on behalf of the living and try to influence the spirits to bring about positive outcomes. Sometimes this would involve making offerings to the spirits or casting spells to drive away evil spirits. In some communities, the shaman would be the one to perform an operation when someone was possessed by an evil spirit. So, what does any of this have to do with skulls? Let's take a look at a few of the most famous examples of trepanated skulls to find out. One of the best-known examples of trepanation comes from the Inca. In 1927, an American explorer named Hiram Bingham III discovered a collection of mummies near the city of Cuzco. The mummies were originally buried inside a cave, but looters had already ransacked the site before Bingham arrived. Among the treasure he found in the cave was one complete skeleton and 3 skulls. 2 of the skulls showed signs of trepanation. The first was a young woman who had a hole drilled into the top of her skull. The second was an older man with 2 holes drilled into his skull. Neither of the 2 skulls had any remains of brain tissue, meaning the patients must have died after the operation. However, there was no sign of infection, meaning the surgery may have been a success. Hiram Bingham didn't realize it at the time, but the skulls were from a group of sacrificial victims known as the Kuchka. The Kuchka were a sect of the Inca nobility, whose duty was to serve as human sacrifices. Members of the Kuchka volunteered for sacrifice so the Inca gods would be pleased. But it wasn't an easy death. The skulls of the Kuchka were trepanated before their deaths so their blood could drain away. Then they had to lie under the stars for 4 days while their brains decomposed. Once their brains were gone, the flesh was removed and they were ready to be entombed. While this may seem like a horrifying fate, it was considered an honor to die this way. It was seen as a way to achieve immortality and join the gods in the afterlife. So the Inca didn't see trepanation as a scary ordeal, but rather a necessary step towards joining the divine. Another well-known example of trepanation comes from the Philippines. In 1961, an archaeological team uncovered a burial site on the island of Luzon. The site contained dozens of skeletons, but one of the skeletons stood out from the rest. The skeleton had a hole drilled into the top of its skull. At first, archaeologists thought the hole was a result of violence, but they later realized it was a case of trepanation. This individual wasn't killed by another human, but rather by a shaman trying to cure a disease. Archaeologists determined the individual was a female based on the bone structure. She had given birth at least once and died sometime between the ages of 20 and 40. What's interesting is that she was buried alongside a man who showed no signs of trepanation. The two may have been husband and wife, though some researchers have speculated they may have been related. This isn't clear because the bones found were too decayed to determine the exact relationship between them. But what was the purpose of the procedure for her? As mentioned earlier, it could have been a last-ditch effort to save her life. Perhaps she had an ailment that her shaman believed could be cured by trepanation, or maybe she suffered a traumatic injury that required treatment. Whatever the reason, it's safe to say the procedure was unsuccessful because she died anyway. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth a try. After all, what other options did she have? Modern science can explain what caused her eventual death. A blow to the head can cause a subdural hematoma, which is a collection of blood that forms between the brain and the skull. As the blood fills up, it puts pressure on the brain and can cause it to swell. Eventually, the brain can become so damaged it stops functioning properly. If this happens, the person will lapse into a coma and die. In this case, the trepanation probably made things worse. By removing part of the skull, it would have made it easier for the blood to pool up and put pressure on her brain. It's possible she survived the initial injury, but the trepanation made it impossible for her to make a full recovery. It's important to remember that trepanation wasn't always performed with bad intentions. In some cases, it was a desperate attempt at helping someone in need. Other times, it was done to help someone connect with the divine. Regardless of the reason, trepanation is a fascinating part of history that helps us understand the beliefs and practices of our ancestors. Now you know the dark reason behind the mysterious skulls. What did you think? Is there anything we missed? Let us know in the comments below, and tell us what you want to see next. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Did these women inhale toxic fumes to give the greatest visions in history? Welcome to my channel. Today, we're taking a look at the oracle healers of Delphi, priestesses who inhaled toxic fumes and gave visions of cures. Many have heard of the Oracle of Delphi, the mysterious priestess who is said to have predicted the future by inhaling toxic gases that came from a crevice in the earth at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, Greece. But what many people do not know is that there were actually many oracles or prophetesses who all had their own unique ways of receiving their visions. Some used hallucinogenic plants, while others used poisonous snakes. But one group of oracles took things to a whole new level by inhaling toxic fumes. And if you think this sounds crazy, just wait until you hear how it all started. Long ago, in the ancient world, there was a small town in Greece called Delphi. Delphi was home to a number of temples, but the most important was the Temple of Apollo, god of music, poetry, and healing. One day, Apollo was walking through the town when he heard some people talking about how they needed a way to heal the sick. Apollo felt sorry for them, so he decided to help. He went up to the top of Mount Parnassus, where he built his famous temple. Then he sent a golden eagle down to show the people where they could find the most healing plant in the world. The eagle landed in a cave and cawed loudly, letting everyone know that this was where they needed to come for help. Of course, the townspeople didn't know this at first, so they asked Apollo for guidance. Apollo told them that the only way they could be cured was to inhale the fumes coming from the crevice in the ground. These fumes, he said, would carry their pain away and replace it with health and vitality. At first, the townspeople were hesitant. After all, they didn't know what kind of fumes these caves produced. But desperate times call for desperate measures. So several of them decided to venture inside anyway. When they did, they experienced something truly amazing. As soon as they inhaled the fumes, their pain began to vanish. They felt healthier and stronger than they had in years. Word of this spread quickly, and soon people from all over Greece were heading to Delphi hoping for a cure. It wasn't long before a small community of healers formed in the town. They were known as the Oracle Healers of Delphi, and they took it upon themselves to help as many people as possible. But it wasn't easy. You see, the fumes didn't always work like they were supposed to. Sometimes they made people feel worse, and other times they even drove them insane. In fact, some say that's how the Oracle of Delphi got her powers. According to legend, she was a simple girl named Pythia, who was chosen by Apollo to be his oracle. She was given the task of inhaling the fumes and delivering messages from the gods. But one day, as she was inhaling the fumes, they drove her crazy. She went into a trance and began babbling incoherently. At first, Apollo was angry, but then he realized that this could be useful. He decided to use her madness to predict the future. And so the Oracle of Delphi was born. Over the years, she and her successors became famous throughout the ancient world. People traveled from far and wide to hear their predictions and seek their help in healing. But what exactly were these fumes that had such a powerful effect on people? No one is 100% sure, but there are some theories. Some say that the fumes were a type of methane gas that was seeping out of the earth. Others say that they were caused by volcanic activity deep below the surface. Whatever the case may be, we know that they were powerful enough to put people into trances and make them feel like they were inhaling the purest oxygen. In fact, it was said that the fumes smelled so good that many people couldn't stop inhaling them. They would literally pass out from exhaustion because they refused to stop smelling the fumes. And it wasn't just the smell that was intoxicating. The fumes also had a strange effect on the mind. Many people reported seeing visions or having their minds blown with new ideas. Some even claimed to have seen the gods themselves standing right in front of them. It was as if the fumes opened up their minds and allowed them to see the world in a whole new light. Of course, not everyone was so lucky. Some people inhaled the fumes and simply passed out. They would wake up feeling fine, but they had no memory of the previous day. Other times, the fumes would cause people to go into violent fits. They would thrash around uncontrollably, foaming at the mouth and screaming at the top of their lungs. It was a terrifying sight to behold, and many people were afraid that they would lose their minds if they inhaled too much of the fumes. But despite the risks, people still flocked to Delphi hoping for a cure or a vision from the gods. They knew that it was dangerous, but they were willing to take the risk. After all, what did they have to lose? And the oracle healers were more than happy to help them. They welcomed everyone who came to Delphi, regardless of their social status or background. They believed that everyone deserved a chance at healing and that the fumes had the power to do just that. The oracle healers didn't just inhale the fumes themselves. They also helped others to do it as well. They would guide them through the process, making sure that they didn't inhale too much or too little. They also provided them with food and water to keep them hydrated and nourished while they were in the caves. It was a lot of work, but the oracle healers didn't mind. They were happy to do whatever they could to help others. They were some of the most selfless people in the ancient world, and their dedication to helping others is truly inspiring. But not everyone was so selfless. There were some people who tried to take advantage of the oracle healers and the fumes. Some people would sneak into the caves at night and inhale the fumes without anyone knowing. They would do this in hopes of gaining special powers or knowledge, but they often ended up driving themselves insane instead. Other times, people would try to bribe the oracle healers into giving them better predictions. But the oracle healers were never swayed by money or power. They believed that everyone should have a chance at healing, and that the fumes should be available to all. Sadly, this didn't last forever. Eventually, the Roman Empire took over Greece and banned the oracle healers from using the fumes. They believed that it was a form of paganism and wanted to stamp it out. This was a devastating blow to the oracle healers, but they didn't give up. They continued to help people in any way they could, even if it meant that they had to go into exile. The legacy of the oracle healers of Delphi lived on for centuries. People continued to visit the temple of Apollo hoping for a cure or a vision from the gods. And though the oracle healers were gone, their spirit lived on in the people who kept their memory alive. Their story is one of courage, compassion, and selflessness. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still prevail. What are your thoughts on the oracle healers of Delphi? Do you think the fumes really had healing powers? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.